If you just bought a Sony ZV-E1, congratulations. It's an amazing camera that can shoot amazing footage if you know how to set it up correctly. So in today's episode of Make It Happen Mondays, I'm going to share my own Sony ZV-E1 camera settings. And as I go through, I'll explain each of the settings. So even if you're new to Sony, by the end of the video, you'll have a good idea of what each setting does and why you should use it. And make sure you subscribe if you want to see more content like this. All right, so here we are with my Sony ZV-E1. Now, the first thing I usually double check is my shooting resolution. So in order to find it, just come to the main section in your menu system. It's up the top. It'll be this white one with the house and the camera. Then just go across. You've got main 1 and main 2. Let's go to main 1. So go across again and then come down to this little section here where it's got XAVC, S, 4K. It might say something different on your camera depending on how it's set up. Just go into this one and then you've got all these different options. They're all XAVC and I won't go into detail too much about what that means, but we've got these different types. We've got HS, S, and then SI. Now, very simply, in my opinion, the best one to shoot in for most people is just the standard S. That means your file sizes aren't too big, but they're also easy to use. HS uses a different compression type, but not all computers can handle it as well. Plus, it limits your frame rate options. So I usually just skip that one. And then lastly, we've got SI, and this is going to give you the highest quality, but also the biggest file sizes, which is why I don't use it. My SD card actually can't even handle it. That's why I just keep it on XAVC S4K. I don't go HD, go 4K. And then I know my resolution is correct. So I'm going to get the full resolution out of this camera. Next, I double check my frame rate. Now for me, as someone who lives in Australia, 25 frames per second is the standard shooting mode. If you're in America, it might be 24 frames per second. If you want to shoot in higher speed, obviously bump it up to a higher frame rate. So when I shoot in slow-mo, I'll usually make it 50 or 100 frames per second. But for now, I'm just shooting in normal speed. So I'm going to go 25 frames. Next, you want to double check your shutter speed and making sure you've got the correct shutter speed corresponding to your current frame rate is really important to make sure you get natural looking motion blur, because otherwise your motion blur will look off. And the easy way to remember it is to just make sure your shutter speed is always set to double your frame rate. So for me, I've got my frame rate at 25 frames. So I want to double my shutter speed to 1/50. Obviously you can change this and make it more like 1/100 or all the way up to 1/10. But again, because we've got our frame rate at 25, we want to double it 1/50. And then if you're shooting in 50 frames, for example, just make sure your shutter speed's at 1/100. Next, I want to check my ISO. Now this is an interesting one. So you might be used to using ISO a lot. I was when I first got this camera. So if my scene's too dark, what I used to do is I would bump up my ISO just a little bit, move it up to like 1600 just to brighten up my frame. With the Sony ZV-E1, this is actually a dual native ISO, which basically means that it's essentially only got 2 ISO settings. Now I know obviously here you can see it's got heaps of different options, but really the only 2 you want to actually ever use is ISO 640 and then ISO 12800. Now the reason for this is 640 is the lower base. So if you're shooting in a really bright environment, like I am right now, like I'm shooting in quite a bright environment, 640 is basically the lowest my ISO will go before it starts adding noise into my shot. And I definitely don't want that. So anytime I'm shooting in a bright environment, I'll have it set to 640. However, if it gets too dark and 640 isn't bright enough, that's when I'll bump it all the way up to 12,800, because this is the next lowest base of ISO before it introduces noise. So you'll notice you can't really see it in this frame, but ISO 10,000 is actually really noisy. It's pretty much unusable no matter how well exposed your overall frame is. But when you bump it up to 12,800, the entire frame will clear up, there'll be no noise, and you'll be good to go. So just make sure you always only ever have your ISO set to 640 or 12,800. Then if your image is too dark or too bright, you want to adjust other settings like your aperture. So if I turn this up, it's going to make my overall frame darker. Turn it down, it brightens it up. Or I'll want to adjust my actual light source. So I might want to turn up my lighting in my studio, take the shoot outdoors, whatever it is. But I just want to make sure my ISO setting is always the same. All right, next let's talk about the color profile on your camera. So by default, if we go back to our menu, it will probably be set to picture profile off. Just like this. So it'll say PP off. Now, as you can see in our preview, that looks pretty standard. It looks like normal footage, but I'm telling you right now, never ever use this setting on the Sony ZV-E1. If you do, it's a total waste of a camera in my opinion, because you'll never get the maximum image quality that you could get from this camera using this color setting. So what I do recommend, if you don't know how to color grade and you don't really want to learn it just yet, I recommend using S-Cinetone. Now, in order to turn that on, just go back to your menu and then where it says PP off or picture profile off, click on that and then go down to PP11. Now, if you click sideways, you'll see that the gamma and the color mode is both set to S-Cinetone. The camera is essentially trying to replicate what some of the more expensive Sony cinema cameras actually look like. So if you want a cinematic looking image right out of camera without any color grading needed, S-Cinetone is the way to go for sure. There's going to be more details in your shadows, so like back here, and then in the highlights in the bright areas of my image, there's also going to be more detail. However, if you do want the absolute best image quality out of your ZV-E1, then you will want to be shooting in S-Log. If you don't know what S-Log is, it's essentially the raw video type that you can get from the camera. Again, you go back to menu and then don't go back into picture profile, but instead go back over to where we've got main 1 and main 2, go down to main 2, and then here you can see where it says log off. Hit that, and then we've got log shooting off, and we just want to turn this on. And then once that's on, just double check your color gamut is set to S-Gamut3.Cine with S-Log 3. And now if we go back to our preview, you can see that our shot looks really flat, and that's what we want. That's how we know we're shooting in a log color profile. So we're going to have a lot more dynamic range in our shot. So we're going to have more details in our shadows and more details in our highlights. And you're also going to have a lot more options when it comes to color grading in post. Now it can be a little bit hard on our preview when everything looks so flat. It can be a bit hard to judge our exposure and that type of thing. So go back to menu, go back up to main 1, and then here where it says LUT off, go into there and hit on, and then just make sure this setting here, which is your LUT selection, is set to S09. So if you see here, this is what S-Log 3 looks like with no conversion. And then S09 will give you a basic idea of what your raw footage will look like once it's converted. So make sure that's turned on. And then if we go back to our preview, we can actually see what our converted image will look like. And you can already see that we've already got better dynamic range than we did with the previous picture profile, both S-Cinetone and when there was no picture profile applied. Now the last thing really to think about is your white balance. Hit the function button on your camera, and then right here in the bottom corner or somewhere on this menu will be your white balance. Just click on that. The main thing to remember is never use auto, because that's going to screw with your color grading when you take it into post. So currently I've got my big light set to daylight temperature. So I have this set to daylight when I'm shooting my YouTube videos, but feel free to experiment with these. If you're shooting outdoors on a cloudy day, you could try using cloudy. There's more settings for indoor lights, or you can manually set it using the Kelvin scale. Just go into here and you can manually adjust your color temperature to whatever looks correct for your scene. But again, the main thing is just to keep it the same for each scene so that you can easily color grade it in post. So I hope that helps with setting up your video settings. If you'd like a more in-depth video on how to set up the menus, even a video going through the entire menu system and explaining each thing, let me know in the comments, because I'd be more than happy to make a video like that. Now, before you go out and shoot anything, make sure you watch this video here where I talk about, in my experience, the best and the worst things about owning a Sony ZV-E1.